Okay, so this is in prelude to our Marine Week, and I'm going to talk a bit about getting you ready to think about marine resources. This is going to talk a bit about um, how we are depleting marine resources. I'll talk a bit about whaling and how we have policies developed to protect whales, something that we had more or less or close to extirpated from the ocean earlier, and or at least severely depleted. And then our reading for this week is going to be about marine protected areas as a strategy for protecting marine resources. And we'll read a paper for Monday about that just come out in 2013 in a special issues of Oceans and Marine Management or something like that on this particular issue. Okay, so context. Each generation since the 1700s has had fewer ocean resources than the one before, and we're projecting that we're running out. And this graphic in the background is this idea of fishing down the food web that we used to fish for big food fish, and we've been fishing for smaller and smaller and smaller fish as we deplete the ocean of these larger fish as generations go by. Uh, the fact of the matter is that we're good at fishing. We know how to catch fish everywhere from angling and hand lines to these long line fishing techniques to purse setting, bottom trawling, and pelagic trawling. We are effectively sweeping stuff out of the ocean at a remarkable rate. And as a consequence, we're running out. And so that's what this is looking at here. This is from a textbook in the upper left here, but basically the idea is time's moving across the x-axis. Here we are in 1950, and we're looking that there were about more than half the fisheries of the world were undeveloped, and that means they had low catch, and that most of the rest of the fisheries were developing, and that there were very few fisheries that were fully developed or senescent. In other words, that they had decreasing catches. But as we move forward in time through to the 1980s, and this is only to 1994, you'll see that we have now a large fraction of fisheries that are fully developed. There are no undeveloped fisheries anymore, and that we're developing about 40% of these fisheries relatively rapidly, and the number of senescent fisheries where they were declining our catch, is increasing year by year. And if you look at this, this is another take on this here, which is looking at the state of the world's fishery stocks. In 2004, we're saying that we have some 25% of our stocks are overexploited or are effectively depleted. We have half of our fishing stocks that are fully exploited, and a quarter of our fishing stocks that are underexploited, and that we're moving in not a good direction on all of this. So Boris Worm and others did this, studied this in a little bit more detail, and you don't need to worry about the various colors, diamonds and triangles, but basically the black lines represent a wedge of our competence in the information, and the vertical axis represents collapsed taxa. So taxa whose fishery has completely collapsed. And again, 1950, that hadn't really happened much at all. By the time we get to 2000, somewhere between 30 and 60% of our fisheries have collapsed for individual fishes, and the map inset is showing where we have been overfishing the worst, and Southeast Asia is certainly one of those areas. And that if you follow this trajectory out, it suggests that by 2050 something, we will be effectively out of fish. And this is and that's what's shown in this next graph rather, is the UN Food and Agriculture Organization looking at global fisheries from 1950 through 2050, and again the percentage of collapsed species, and an estimate that we're moving towards a projection of losing all of our fishes in the near future. And so it's increasingly frequent that we see things like this in the news, that there's a fishing crisis going on, that we're losing our fisheries, and that we need to do something about it quickly. Well, one might think, well, as aquaculture to the rescue, here's some FAO data looking at how many fish we've been catching. Again, this is up through the late 90s, but it's looking like the amount of fish that we're catching is plateauing, and the amount of fish that we're growing through aquaculture is increasing. And I'll spend a little bit of time on that, about thinking about the challenges with aquaculture in terms of pollution and things like this. But that just bear in mind that we really are lacking in adequate policies to deal with aquaculture, because it hasn't previously been a major source of food, and it's becoming one, and it's a relatively unregulated environment. But some history. So, this goes on and on in resource after resource after resource. Jeremy Jackson had spent a lot of time thinking about sea turtles. Those little inset pictures off to the right are sea turtle harvesting around 1900. All the sugarcane plantations that were in the Caribbean that were run by the British and French, and mostly using slaves, mostly fed these people on sea turtles. And in fact, the British kept meticulous records of how many sea turtles they caught, in that process. But here you have a graph, basically, when 1500, when Christopher Columbus sailed through the Caribbean, green sea turtles were so abundant that one of his men wrote in his diary, the sea was thick with them, so that it seemed the ships would run aground on them as if we were bathing in them. And as you go down through time, by 2001, the many tens of millions of sea turtles in the Caribbean easily exceeded the abundance and biomass of large animals on East Africa. And all we do today is micromanage the remnants of a once vast population. And so you can pause the thing and read these if you want, but basically it's a fishery that we have fully exploited, and we have to see this over and over again. Mounds of oyster shells in these different around different fisheries, massive fish that used to be hauled out of the ocean that we aren't hauling out of the ocean anymore. There's a whole organization on shifting baselines. Through the Census of Marine Life that is dedicated to making us think about this changing set of ocean resources. And you see these amazing studies periodically. Like here is a board on a dock in 1950s hauling in the trophy catch from some tour boat that went out. Here's that same dock in the 1980s, and here's that same dock in 2007, that going out and catching a bunch of fish in a day-long cruise doesn't mean the same thing now as it meant 50 years ago. So this problem isn't the first time we've dealt with this, that we used whale products for oil, meat, baleen, bone. An awful lot of the products that we use for whales for have been replaced, but they were put into hoops and skirts and were burned in lamps with oil. And so there was a huge whaling industry, and that whales were hunted to near extirpation. And in 1946, the International Whaling Commission formed. It was an international treaty, but not all countries signed, and it was to bring countries together to save whales. Well, like CITES, once a country joins, it's bound to the decisions, and it should uphold them. And in 1982, this group set a moratorium on whaling, saying we don't know how to sustainably harvest whales, and so until we do, we're going to not whale. And so among the other things that's difficult in dealing with whales, not only do they reproduce slowly, but they're out in the blue ocean and they're very difficult to detect. And so our tools for estimating population size have been growing through time. But it's also fair to say that whales aren't just whales. There's all sorts of whales, and that their population trajectories differ from one from another. And that one of the problems we've had with whales is that we aren't entirely certain for some species where they breed, and whether an Atlantic and a Pacific population that go through the Arctic are a single population or multiple populations. So they're very difficult things to deal with. In the meantime, we've progressed quite a lot in terms of technologies and such that and some of these populations have recovered, such that some whaling countries like Norway and Japan in particular feel that we now have the tools that we can engage in sustainable harvest of whales, and yet the Whaling Commission refuses to bend on this idea of a ban on whaling. And so what Japan does is they have research whaling. So they're saying they're doing research on whales and harvesting some whales. And the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society and Greenpeace and others are notable for trying to thwart their efforts to harvest whales out of the ocean. And this gets into the newspaper quite a lot as people are concerned about Japan and Norway's position on whales. Well, this is all hashed out at the International Whaling Commission, like CITES and like the CBD and like all these other kind of international agreements, IPCC. There are conferences of the parties, and they meet and they discuss issues that are of concern and try and negotiate settlements. And so if you look here, this is an old thing. This is from 2009, but you see things like Tanzania joins the International Whaling Commission, Eritrea joins the International Whaling Commission, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland. Most of these are countries that don't have any active whaling fleets, haven't had any active whaling fleets for years, and they're joining as a political statement, and that there's political ping pong going on. So here was a list of member nations a few years back, total of 85. Notice over on the right, Mongolia. It's a landlocked country, and they belong to the International Whaling Commission. So it's a country that's never had any whaling going on. And you can imagine they're allied with Japan. Other countries are allied with the U.S. And what really is happening now is this jockeying, going back and forth, getting different countries in for the contingent, including the United States and Great Britain, that would like to see the ban on whaling maintained, in Japan and Norway wanting to see the ban on whaling relaxed, each trying to bring member nations in that would vote on their side of the aisle. And so it becomes then a political thing. But unlike the CBD and CITES, it's actually something that's moderately well maintained, that there aren't a lot of countries or boat ships out there illegally whaling, that whales are big enough, and that there's enough people like Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd that appear to be watchdogging it, that non-compliance by countries that have signed on doesn't seem to be a major issue. And what really is the sticking point is whether Japan is correct, and that now with increased technologies, both in terms of spotting and tracking whales, and increased capacities for enforcement and GPS and following markets, that you have a better capacity to constrain whaling so that it doesn't go out of control, and other countries that think that we do not have enough knowledge to do that. But again, it's one of these policies that's really important in sort of setting a baseline for how we think about dealing with species that are of conservation concern, that spend an awful lot of time in international waters, waters that nobody owns. And another major one that is very much like this now, but isn't going well at all, is the population problem with fishing fins for shark fins, and that they also spend a lot of time in international waters, although there's a lot of sharks in domestic waters as well. But there's no major international body of policy that will protect sharks, and so mostly this falls under the purview of CITES and has its own problems there. So during the lecture, we're going to read the paper and think about California marine protected areas as a way to constrain harvest of fishes, and we'll do that. We'll have a student group leading a discussion that I'm going to try and keep to no more than 35 or 40 minutes, and then we'll also talk about what we know about fish and fisheries, the collapse of fisheries. All right, see you Monday.